Dear friends, trucks are silly things. They rattle, bang and chatter to each other so much that they can never hear what their engine says. Even if they did, they probably wouldn't take any notice. They pushed Mavis into a lorry, and that made extra work for Toby and Percy while she was being mended. But on the other hand, perhaps they're not all bad. After all, they did teach Bulstrode a lesson. See what you think. The author. Mavis is a diesel engine belonging to the Farquhar Quarry Company. She is in charge of the stone trucks at the quarry, and when Toby is busy or there are too many trucks for him to manage by himself, she is allowed to bring a loaded train down to Farquhar. She enjoys this because the journey gives her a chance to stretch her wheels. Besides, she sometimes finds it dull up at the quarry with no one to talk to but trucks. For most of the way, the line runs beside a road. Mavis is always very careful, especially at the place where Thomas once had an argument with a policeman. A road crosses the line here, and though there are warning signs, some of the cars and lorries come round the corner much too fast. They make Mavis nervous. "There'll be an accident one day," Mavis's driver often says as they pass the place, and she feels sure he's right. One day Mavis was late. The trucks had been in all the wrong places, and she had to waste time sorting them out. As she came down the line, she felt them surge against her. "Stop pushing," she growled at the misbehaving trucks. They neared the crossing, and Mavis saw a lorry coming towards them. "He'll stop when he sees us," she thought. But she couldn't know the lorry driver was new to the island. The last thing he expected to see was a train. Much too fast, the lorry approached the corner. Too late, the driver realised it was sharper than he expected. He swerved, and at that moment he saw Mavis halfway across the road. He braked hard and swung the steering wheel, but he was too late. The lorry's front bumper just caught Mavis's cowcatcher, and the lorry left the road and skidded into a ditch. With a loud crash, it fell onto its side. Mavis, who had already stopped, watched in horror. "Ouch!" she exclaimed. "That hurt!" "I didn't push him over," she cried in alarm. Her driver laughed and jumped down. "No one's blaming you," he said, "but I hope the lorry driver is all right." The lorry's right-hand door was deep in the ditch, but now a figure could be seen struggling to climb out at the other side. Mavis's driver went to help. "Is that a train?" the man demanded. Mavis's driver laughed. "It certainly is," he said. "You must be new on the island not to have seen us before." Mavis's front was bent, but she wasn't badly hurt. Her owner sent her to be mended and asked the Fat Controller if he could borrow Toby while she was away. "What about the trucks down here, sir?" Toby asked anxiously. The Fat Controller nodded. "I'm afraid it will mean more work for you, Percy," he said, "but Toby's side plates will make him the only engine who can go up there. You remember what happened to Thomas, don't you?" And with that they had to be content. The Fat Controller first met Toby and Henrietta a long time ago when he was on holiday in East Anglia. Later, when their line was closed, the Fat Controller heard about what had happened and brought them to Sodor. Before that, Toby had worked at a harbour with several of his brothers. The harbour had been busy, and the engines were kept bustling about. But Toby never really had a chance to exercise his pistons properly until he had his own line to run on. One day, Toby was resting alone in the shed at Farquhar. Earlier, Percy had been talking about the harbour at Knapford. Toby remembered the old days when he had worked at a harbour too. "I'm too old now to dash about like I did then," he thought. "Backwards and forwards all day long, between the harbour and the big station, with never any chance of a holiday. But I did go to the seaside once," he remembered. "For a while, at any rate." His driver and fireman had been so excited when they came to work one day. "We've been promised a trip to the seaside," they said. "What do you mean?" asked Toby. "There's a seaside village near here," explained the driver, "where they have a festival each year. Lots of people come to it, and one of the organisers thinks it would be a good idea to have a display of engines at the station as an extra attraction. And you, Toby, are to be one of them." Toby went to the shed at the big station. He was given new paint, a new bell, and his brasswork was polished until his driver could see himself in it. "You haven't looked so smart for years," he said. "I nearly didn't recognise you." They set out for the junction where the branch line to the village began. As they arrived, a train came in from the branch. The engine was younger than Toby, but he was dirty. His rods clanked and steam leaked from everywhere. "The poor engine," said Toby. "Could I help pull his next train to the seaside, please?" The station master agreed, so Toby was coupled in front. "Festival time is the best time of year," the other engine explained. "Lots of extra trains and visitors. I expect you'll be able to stand on the long carriage siding." They soon reached the seaside station, where the station master came out to meet them. He was surprised to see Toby. He stared, frowned, and went away shaking his head. Next day, Toby was excited. He woke up early and saw the sea sparkling in the distance. White birds wheeled and swooped overhead, making loud mewing noises. "I wonder what those birds could be," thought Toby. "My driver's sure to know. I'll ask him when he gets here." But his crew arrived looking glum. "It's all off, Toby," his driver told him. "They say there's nowhere for you to stand." "But what's wrong with here?" wailed Toby. "I'm not in anybody's way where I am at the moment." "It's just an excuse, I reckon," said Toby's driver, lowering his voice. "The real trouble is you're too smart, Toby. They're afraid you'll show their branch line up." Just then, a door banged. Toby jumped. "Wake up, Toby," smiled his driver. "Time to get back to work." Toby sighed as he moved from the shed. "Well, I did get to the seaside," he murmured, "even if it wasn't for long. But I think the Fat Controller would have managed all that festival business much better." A few days later, Percy was shunting in the yard at Farquhar when the station master came up. "Leave those trucks, please, Percy," he said. "There's an emergency down at the harbour. The Fat Controller wants you to go and sort it out straight away." "But Toby can't," began Percy. "Never mind that," the station master said. "The Fat Controller needs you double quick. Leave us to worry about the shunting." He hurried away to make the arrangements. Bulstrode was a barge used for carrying stone. He was a disagreeable barge. Nothing was ever right for him, and he grumbled unceasingly. Trucks grumbled too, but they weren't a patch on Bulstrode. Come on," shouted Bulstrode rudely one morning. "Why aren't you trucks where you should be? How can I be loaded if you dawdle about up there, eh?"
"There's no engine, and we can only go where we're put,"
retorted the trucks crossly.
"You're in the wrong place, not us."
They argued for some time, but it made no difference. Bulstrode was in the wrong place, and he was not due to leave until the next day. But he wasn't going to let a little thing like that stop him complaining. When Percy arrived, Bulstrode was sulking, and the trucks were annoyed with him.
"Our stone is for Bulstrode,"
they said.
"Please put us into the siding so that we can load him up and be rid of him as soon as possible."
The line slopes down to the harbour. Percy pulled the trucks a little way up the hill, clear of the points. As he stopped, one of the truck's brakes slipped on. When Percy began to push, the truck started with a jerk, and a coupling broke. 4 loose trucks, heavy with stone, gathered speed.
"Help! Help!"
they wailed. A shunter bravely tried to stop them, but only broke his pole. The trucks rattled along the quay, straight towards Bulstrode, unsuspecting at the end. Bulstrode heard a rattle and a shout or two, but he could see nothing. The first he knew of anything wrong was when 4 loaded stone trucks shot one by one off the end of the quay to bury themselves in his hold. "Oof!" he exclaimed, but anything else was lost in a gurgle as the trucks burst a hole in his hull and water began to pour in. Bulstrode experienced an awful sinking feeling. "Save, he spluttered. "I'm drowning." But Bulstrode didn't drown. As chance would have it, the tide was out, so he did not go right under the water. The trucks were upset at losing some of their friends, but they were very little bothered about Bulstrode.
Nothing but a nuisance he was,
they said to each other.
always barging in and moaning about not being loaded fast enough.
They sniggered.
This time he got his load faster than he bargained for. Serves him right if you ask us.
Percy was kept busy for some time afterwards, clearing up the mess. When the remains of the trucks had been lifted out of the water, he took them to the scrapyard while workmen rescued what stone they could. As for Bulstrode, when everything else had been cleared, his remains were towed to a nearby beach where they could do no harm. Now children play happily among the wreckage. If Bulstrode is still grumbling, as I expect he is, the children take no notice. While Percy was away, Terence had done all the shunting in the yard. "Adaptable," he boasted. "That's what my owner says I am. Go anywhere, do anything. That's me. You take my advice and scrap your rails. Broaden your outlook like me." "Pooh," said Percy. "Me plough a field? I'd prefer to stay on my rails, thank you." "Steam engines really did plough once upon a time," Terence chuckled, "and ran on roads." The engines remembered Trevor, and had to admit that Terence was right about that. Repairs to Mavis took longer than expected, and Toby became used to trundling off to the quarry each morning. Because of Toby's small water tank, his driver and fireman had arranged with the quarry manager that they should bring loaded trucks down to Farquhar at lunchtime instead of later in the day. This saved time too, for Toby would otherwise have needed an extra journey to fill his water tank. This way, he delivered the trucks and got water in one visit. Time passed and the weather became colder, with hard frosts during the night. They didn't worry Toby. His fire kept him nice and warm, and he puffed happily to and fro, arranging the trucks, taking them down to the yard, and bringing back empty ones. One night it was especially cold. The ground froze and even Toby felt chilly. Brrr! He shivered as he left the shed and set out along the line towards the quarry. When the ground freezes, it swells. At the road crossing where Mavis had had her accident, the frost had swollen the earth in the ruts beside the rails so much that Toby's wheels were lifted off the track. There was a crunching noise, a rumbling, and Toby began to shudder. He was horrified. "Ooh!" he exclaimed. "What's happening?" The line here curves away towards the quarry, but Toby, with no rails to guide his wheels round, simply went straight on. Toby was not going fast. "Whoa there, Toby," said his driver at once, and put on the brakes as hard as he dared. Shakily, Toby stopped with all 6 wheels firmly on the roadway. "Oh dear," he said, looking at the grass verge in front of him. "Now what do we do?" His fireman jumped down. "No problem," he said. "With care we can have you back on the rails in no time." "I don't see how," said Toby sadly. Directed by the fireman, the driver carefully reversed Toby along the ruts his wheels had just made. At last, with a thud and a jolt, Toby felt the rails safely beneath his wheels once more. He heaved a sigh of relief. "Well done, Toby," said his fireman. "I'll spread a few hot ashes from your fire along there so that it doesn't happen again. Then we can get safely up to the quarry, and no one will be any the wiser." But they reckon without the fat controller. When Mavis was home after being mended, he came to see the engines. "What's this I hear, Toby?" he asked. "Trying to be a traction engine, were you?" Toby blushed, but the fat controller wasn't cross. Toby told him about Terence. The fat controller laughed. "If I were you," he said, "I should leave the roads to what they were made for. You stay on the rails. You'll find them much more comfortable for a tram engine like you." Toby was quick to agree.